This is a workshop where a bunch of our teachers got together to discuss best practices and strategies for teaching the Visual Arts IBDP course. Just a disclaimer, this is in no way related with the IBO Association, the International Baccalaureate. It does not take the place of any of their trainings. I highly recommend attending the Category 1, 2, or 3 in person. Phenomenal workshops. It's such a great learning experience, and it's a wonderful way to network with other art teachers. Also, a few resources that we mentioned that could be helpful for you. So without further ado, let's get started with the workshop.
But I hope it'll work. So anyways, let's get back to, I just want to address predicted grades first of all, because that's something that I know a lot of teachers, it's a worry. When I do my predicted grades, um, there's two things that I found very helpful for myself is one thing I do, I keep a Excel spreadsheet, and I list all the students' grades every year. I write down like each of their components, what they score, what I predicted them, and what they finally score. And then literally after 2 years, it was really helpful for me to predict grades because I can look at my students' work and then be like, oh, this is very similar to that student. And I can go back 2 years and be like, what did I score them? And then I can score like, so I try to work around the bias for that way. The other thing that I do always mark low. So whatever I think the student is achieving, I know I have a personal bias, so I always go low. So if I think, oh geez, this student is a 7, it's not. This student is probably a 6, and it could be a high 5. So I know that about myself because I've watched myself predict grades for a few years, so I know that I personally have like a higher bias. And the other thing that I found really was helpful is I moderate with my teachers in my department, so I get them to, we don't discuss the work. I just give them the rubrics, and I show them the digital submissions that we're going to submit, and I ask them to mark it, and then we compare. And it's really interesting because um, in the past, I have one teacher that marks very high and one teacher that was so strict. And I remember when he first gave me his moderated grades, I was horrified. I was like, are you kidding me? You think this child's you think this work is a 4? The student worked so hard. And so I put in my predicted grades, but when the marks came back, he was actually the closest. So getting other people's opinions that aren't related directly to your students, I also found were very useful. So if you're at a school by yourself, you might consider just reaching out to schools in your like close by, or now digitally, we can have a digital network and you can ask them to help moderate before you do those predicted grades. Some of my planning ideas might also help you with your predicted grades as I go along. It might make more sense, but let's just talk about generally how you set up your planning for the 2 years. So how I think about it, this is from my school's atlas. It's just like a very general overview. I thought it would be easier to show how the 2 years are set up. And during the year 1, when the students come, I have about 4 units that I go through in the first year. And the units, each unit has a specific part that I'm highlighting. So the first part, when they come in, I really focus on um, experimentation. I focus on getting them to develop their ideas before doing the final work, because I find that's one of the biggest struggle with IB students nowadays. All the students come in with a one idea and done, like this is what I want to do, and there's not a lot of idea development, which is what they need for their process portfolio. So we do a lot of experimentation during this first unit. The second unit is usually focused on a critical investigation. They have to choose 2 or 3 artworks to critically investigate and then create their final work based on the artworks. The unit number 4 that I have is cultural heritage. That's starting to specifically look at probably the reflective component, refining and reflective. We may create a work and then be like, okay, how can we refine that? How can we change it? Actually, I guess I have 5 here: good versus evil and extractify. These 4 units, they go in and out. So I can take them and change them anyway. It's just a matter of having those units like kind of timed in. And the other thing that I find really interesting in my year 1, my first unit is very heavily teacher led. Pamela, yes, you have a question?
Yes, what was number 3? Sorry.
Oh, cultural heritage, I think is which is basically what we do in that unit is we look at, because I teach in an international school, so students are from many different countries. So we explore the differences between where they're from to where they are, because they're usually in a different cultural environment than where they are a descendant of. So we look at all the different factors, maybe their actual family descent, their culture, where they are, what country they're from, like so many cultural. So we explore that cultural component, which is really useful for IB, because IB really likes you to conceptually and culturally explore things.
Sorry, then I am missing one. It was like experimentation and development of ideas, the critical research, and the cultural heritage, but I don't know what I'm missing.
Oh, can you see the screen that I'm sharing?
Yeah, but
okay. So the first one is experimentation here, then portraits, patterns, and propaganda, cultural heritage, good versus evil, and abstractify.
Got it. Thank you.
Abstractify, to be honest, very, very rarely happens, because what I also do in this planning is lesson 1 is heavily teacher-led. I'm kind of leading, showing them examples, giving them a list of artists to look at. Portraits, they choose in unit 2, they start to get their own agency, so they choose their own artist. Cultural heritage, they're leading their whole game, they're choosing what they want to explore. So by the time we get to good and evil abstractify, it kind of peters out, and they are making their own choices. I want to do this instead, I want to do this instead. So it's kind of meant to be like kind of a reverse pyramid, where it's really my ideas at the beginning, but I'm kind of encouraging their ideas. Also in the middle of the year. Yeah.
Sorry for interrupting. I can't find the hand to raise the hand. So rude. I just have a short question for the second component you said for portraits, patterns, and propaganda, where you say they start choosing their own artist. I just wanted to ask how much is this still directive? So do you still start off with like a shared task, or do they really start with their own investigations already with the portraits, patterns, propaganda, for instance?
Oh, I think I show them. I think to start that unit, I show them, I tell them the idea. We're looking at portraits, patterns, and propaganda, and I show them an artist from each 3. And then I explain the theme, and then I say, okay, now you find artists that you think would be interesting in this, and then we kind of discuss their ideas. And then I also I offer the medium of painting. Usually that's a painting, but I say, do you want to do painting, or do we want to do a mixed media approach? And so basically the students have to, okay, so throughout all of these units, the students are submitting screens. And if you're able to teach the years before IB, like grade 9 or grade 10, I try to get the students in the habit to submit all their work in screens. So for each unit, not only are we working on their artwork, we're at the end of each unit, they're submitting 5 or 6 screens. And by screens, usually it's Keynote or PowerPoint, and it's set up in the same ways as a process portfolio. And I literally start that with them in grade 9. We go through it. So the IB is really invested in the Visual Arts Journal. But I feel like the Visual Arts Journal has really evolved, and I did a few experiments with my students in that we tried one traditional way of doing a whole unit within the visual arts journal, as IB shows in its examples, like writing your critical investigation in the visual arts journal, doing all your sketches. And then we did one fully digital where we did most of that work on screens. And then we took photos of the artwork we're doing and then putting it into screens. And my students found the visual arts journal was more fun. It felt more rewarding to them, but it was way more useful for them to create the screens. So then we just decided all the way through we would use screens, and they use their visual arts journal, like their sketchbook, as a sketchbook, because my students also have, like, now I think most students also have digital options. So a lot of people are doing their work with Procreate on an iPad, or they're doing it on their computer with, you know, Photoshop. So their sketchbook is scattered, you know, throughout all of their apps and stuff. So there's no one sketchbook, and I find it kind of pedantic to expect a student to focus on a traditional sketchbook when I, as an artist, don't do that either. And like, why would you take a photo and print it out and glue it into a sketchbook and then take a photo of that for a process portfolio page? So we kind of digitalized it, and most of my examples you'll see are very digital. Like we work within screens. So the students get in that first year, the students get very used to submitting screens. And it's very helpful so if they do 5 units, they're going to come away with 20 screens done first year. And then what happens is during second year, they have time to edit it and add more. And it really helps them with their process portfolio, because screens are editable. So we can, like, you probably noticed that students' knowledge increases in second year. Like, they just seem to get it around January. And so they can go back and edit those process portfolio screens and change them and update them. But that way we do it, I just feel like it's a little bit more working smart for the students, because their time is so limited in IB anyways. The other thing that you'll notice in year 1 is I start comparative study. Usually I started in January because I want them to start the art making process, get comfortable with it, have two units and 2 viable artworks that may or may not be put into the exhibition. And then they just choose their artists for comparative study. So usually they're choosing artists for comparative study that they've either been looking at through the first 2 units, or ones that they want to look at for the next few units. Because I find that if they can use their artists very clearly throughout year 1 and year 2, then their reflective work, specifically if they're NHL, becomes so much more informed. So it's really helpful if you do your comparative study in year 1, not the reflective part if they're in HL. We do the reflective screens for HL in year 2, but the rest of it, the analysis, if you can do that in year 1, it will inform the students. I also have talked to many students or teachers who do it right away, right at the beginning. So that's also an option. I just like to put it like halfway through, because I like to get the students into making the art as well. The other thing that I do with my students, so they do the year 1, and then during that summer, I give the students the option. It can be a summer, it can be a holiday, it can also be a working holiday. That's totally up to them. I am totally happy to have them work through the summer if they want to. So a lot of the times during the summer, we usually do art challenges, and we kind of set a challenge for ourselves, and we're in communication all summer. We share our artwork. So when they come back in the second year of August, they're kind of continued that artistic conversation all summer. And so they don't have a lot to relearn when they come back in year 2. They're kind of excited and ready to go. So you'll see in my year 2, it's very wide open. It's all student directed explorations throughout the whole. Also, just to clarify, I'm speaking from a northern hemisphere. So my school year is September to June. So if you're from the south, you can just adapt it to your timing. Yeah, so it's basically student directed explorations, and I'm going to show you how I organize that in a minute. And then once we hit January, they have the comparative study process portfolio, where they're refining and reflect, like editing, making sure it's perfect. They're adding that reflection part of the comparative study. The process portfolio, they're editing, reviewing, adding slides from their year 2 part, and then we're deciding the artworks for exhibition. I always think that's so funny. We're deciding our artworks for our exhibition, because in IB's literature, it always says you should choose your best 7 to 11. And most people know if you can get a student to create 11 or 12 artworks, like that is amazing. Like usually at this time, you've got students with maybe 6 or 7 artworks, and they're like struggling to get 1 or 2 more done. So it's kind of funny. I always kind of laugh thinking like, what does IB think that like everyone's making 20 artworks and sharing their best? I think that's cute. Yeah, so they're choosing their best artworks for exhibition. We're preparing it, we're taking the photos, all of that stuff. And my exhibition usually falls in March, a little bit early, because it's usually April when the submissions hit. April 20th kind of usually is the deadline. So we work through that. So that's how I plan it. And a few things that I've found that are very helpful to me is this is the first thing that I do in year 2 when the students come back to school. Each one of the students, we sit down and have a one-on-one meeting. And in year 2, I probably have 2 or 3 one-on-one meetings with the students throughout the year. Like we schedule it, and we look at the calendar. We look at, here's today, here's our exhibition, here's the deadlines, and the students show up in their first week or 2 weeks of school with an idea of what artworks they have created in year 1, what artworks they like, what are their themes or ideas, what are the general ideas they're working with, and what do they want to accomplish in year 2. So they usually show up with an idea, like a list of artworks that they want to create in year 2. So some of those artworks that they have on their list happen. A lot of them are refined, a lot of them change as they go along, but I really like to give them a plan starting at the beginning of year 2 so they know their direction. So this is one of my students' plans. She taped it onto her sketchbook, so it was always there. And my writing is kind of hard to understand, but me and the student, we knew what we were talking about. So you can see where she has her ideas, like snowball flower, mountains, eyes with dots. Like these are just, they're not titles of works. They're just, the student understands what they want to do. They've given me their explanation. I'm like, okay, this sounds like you're going to do this. So we write down our thoughts, and then we mark on the calendar when each of those artworks are going to, when they're going to be working on them and when they're going to be done, which gives the students a really a good understanding of what they're going to do during their second year. It's totally changeable. Every time I meet with the student for their one-on-one, so I would meet with them first in September, probably I will meet with them again in November. They bring this to the meeting, or I will have taken a photo and photocopied it, and we edit like directly. I'm like, okay, so you're supposed to have this done. How's this going? Are we going to still continue this idea? Are we changing this idea? What are we doing with it? So it's a kind of a fluid artwork process, which is really modeled after my own art process, because you guys are probably the same as artists. We're like, I want to do this and this and this and this, and then you get started on something and it takes you down another path and you want to try something else. So that's what we do in the beginning of year 2. And then what I also do in year 2, as soon as the students come back for year 2, there's 2 things that are very useful that I've done. First, I have a community of schools that I work with within the area, and we do mock exhibitions. So we have about 5 schools, and we usually do it in November, and the students choose up to 5 works. None of them have done 5 works, but we give them the option of, present up to 5 works. Usually they choose 3, and we spend the day all together, the 5 schools, all the IB students, and they present their artworks and they explain their artworks to a panel. And the panel is full of the art teachers as well as a few local artists. And so the panel gives the students feedback. The students find this experience very anxiety inducing. They get really worried about it, but it's really helpful to them for that reason, because they get over all their worries and their jitters. So when the exhibition comes around, they've already shown their work, they've already gotten feedback, so they're feeling a lot more confident about their work when they get to their exhibition. And then they get feedback, and they get ideas that are not just mine. Like the other art teachers and the other artists give ideas that I wouldn't have thought about and help them question their direction, so their direction becomes more streamlined. The other thing that I do, once their mock exhibition is done, I take their presentation and I print out all their artworks and I put it on a board. I put all their ideas on a board. And then as they finish each of their artwork, I photocopy it and put it on the board. So it starts to create, I have a better picture of the next year when I was more organized. It starts to create a visual collection of all the students' work, so that they can start to see what their works are going to look like together. Because for exhibition, the main thing for exhibition is all your artworks have to connect. Like there is a connection between your artworks. So I find this really useful. You can see that these are the students' ideas. Like these, I don't usually do themes with artworks, but I do general ideas. Like I usually like to have students have a few different ideas they're working on, because I find that, you know, one artwork might focus on one idea. Like if we look at Lota, her ideas she wanted to explore were like light bulbs, flowers, snakes, insects, broken glass, identity, and homeland. So within her artwork, she's starting, like one artwork was about broken glass and flowers, one artwork was about homeland. So we have these motifs coming through. And then as we get into the works in Unit 2, we can see those ideas kind of like flow within the artworks, and they kind of all come together. So that's a really good way of getting those artworks to connect. And we can also see, when we start to look at the students' work, the colors they choose. And the students also, I find it really interesting, once I put this up, you'll see the students come and just stare at their wall for a while and think, they're thinking the same thing I'm thinking, but they're the artists, so they get to like really consider, oh, this, I like this and this, maybe I could do this as well, or maybe I could do this. So you'll see at the bottom, I always have a to-do list of the artworks they're working on, or the ideas that they're exploring and things. And so I continually add to these two notes here, and then I add to their pictures. So that really helps us kind of visualize and conceptualize our artwork. It also really helps the ones that are a little bit behind schedule, because then visually they have less works up, and so they know what's going on. So it's a little bit more motivating for everyone to kind of stay on schedule. That's and I guess an added bonus, but it's just fascinating once they start putting it up, because the students see everybody's ideas, and it's just it's such a cool conversation, because everyone's doing completely different things. And I think it really helps the students. It gives them a lot of confidence in their ideas and seeing how it's all going to come together. So I think those are my ideas for like planning how to organize that 2-year course. I'm just going to stop the share for a minute and just ask if anybody has any questions, or is some of the experienced teachers in the room want to share their ideas for planning strategies that they found very successful.
I found very interesting, like including principles and elements of design, maybe not as one class for each, but I did something like your experimentation at the beginning, but including certain topics. So for example, I started like drawing some flowers, and then I asked them to draw them in different types of lines, and then to start, I don't know, like changing the thickness, and then doubling it, and then converting this into a sculpture, and then looking for the positive and negative space. So all from the same drawing. So it started kind of like evolving. So I found it interesting because I could talk about the elements and principles. And we could talk about like different language. They had to talk, or like in every drawing, they had to put keywords or language that was going to be useful for the comparative study. And also like to have better explanations in their process portfolio. And so I don't have to do like at any point, like one presentation for principles and elements of design and vocabulary, but they have it. So I think that was something useful and interesting for them to see on the same time how it evolves as an artwork. And at the end, we did some crazy experimentations about like dripping paint on top of a paper and trying to get something, and then like making a kind of a critique session, which one worked better, how did they feel with the experimentation of the different materials, and not only like liking or disliking one product, but like why does it look better than the other? I don't know if it's, so I did like a lot your idea about experimentation with different materials. And I think it helps a lot in year one, because it's going to be something, I don't know, they get like very stressed on, I really don't know how to draw, or I'm not very good at this. So I don't know, I think that helps them lose a little bit of that stress and just get something done that at the end is going to be like a good result.
Thank you, Pamela. Yeah, that's great. You also reminded me about the art vocabulary, which is super important for the comparative study. I have wall posters that I put up. So when I teach middle school, we go over elements and principles of design, and I have manipulation vocabularies, but I made wall posters, so they're up all the time. So I always have the students refer to that vocabulary. And so focusing on it for a unit is also very important, especially if you have the students that are coming to you without art background. That's vocabulary that they definitely need to know. So that's very useful.
I have a question, if I may. This is Colette.
Sure.
Hi. Thank you for all you shared. I think we will probably start using that notice board in our classroom. I think that would be great. I just wanted to ask you a question. My interpretation of the criteria for IB is that I really feel like IB really concentrates on more traditional applications, and they're looking for a high skill set. I'm not seeing so much merit in the grading with more experimental work. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. Like, I feel like they say risk taking and experimentation, but I'm not seeing that in the higher grades. What's your
I agree. I completely agree with you. And I also think because so the IGCSE is from the UK curriculum, but I find over time IB is kind of I don't know who's following who, like which curriculum is following which, but I do find that there's a lot of linkage between expectations for those two, and the IGCSE is much more technically like it requires the assessment relies more heavily on technicality, I guess, right? Like on technical works. So I do find that IB does in the grades, if you can show skill, you will score higher. And but that's also, I think, because art is a skill-based course, I guess, and all the art teachers, like examiners, are art teachers. So I think experimentation is difficult to assess that technical competence, right? Because you can get amazing artwork out of experimentation that doesn't look like the student had, like you can't see the skill, is basically what I'm saying. So if you have students that do experimentation or highly conceptual work, try to have a balance. I like to encourage my students to have a few pieces that like show their technical skill, especially if they have it. Show that. You need to show the examiners that you are amazing in this skill. And I'll probably talk to that more when I get to the exhibition.
Thank you for that.
Hopefully in the next installment, video will be allowed in that, like within the process portfolio. Like how amazing to have a, you know, a work in progress video. And I feel like that would start to show your skill. And so that might open up more for the experimentation ideas, because there's a lot of really skilled artists that have gone through learning the skills and knowing the technical and out the other side. And that's where the experimentation comes from. And so that gets, you know, like that's above and beyond. But that's hard to explain if you just see the exhibition piece. So Vijay, did you have a question?
No, I have not a questions. I mean, I agree the both the valuable points, and the current curriculum also they have a lot of modifications. In even you must be aware about the glossaries, like in the visual arts guide we have a bunch of glossaries, which is again the most important, and some of them which is not. I mean, during the review we have lot of things because when you compare with the content flow and the glossary, it is has to be balanced. I mean, that is also very, very important because I mean, I used to do in my strategy planning in my things, you know, I used to go for a kind of a reverse method, like I pick up the glossaries, and from that, you know, how we can clarify and unwrap the criterias what they are expecting from IB, and what Colin said about the new experimentations. It is very tough to get the things. I mean, I really agree the point, and especially like performance or the sound. In sound, they are not taking for that sound art or sound designs. They are not accepting as a. They will cut the marks. So these are the things. It is a still it is in the process and the issues. Still they are defining the things. I think the new syllabus will be giving a lot of new ideas and new changes will come, and also have issues with being examiner, which what we have noticed, and certain things. The evaluation is very, 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 very tough. I mean, their expectations, which is too high. Yeah.
Thank you, Vijay. It's a difficult question because when you include sound in your artwork, you have to keep in mind copyright and where the music comes from and appropriation and all of those things. So there's, yeah, definitely. And I just want to clarify as well, experimentation within my planning, I have found the experimentation part is super useful for the process portfolio. A lot of examiners in the process portfolio note that they don't get enough with that idea development and experimentation. So if you're doing experimentation in your class, make sure you're taking a lot of photos of your students and getting them to explain it. But in the final artworks, technical skill, it really does have, I think, a much stronger weight than experimentation. So I guess for the different components, I just note back to all my students that score 7, their technical skill is off the charts. Like it's very obvious that they're very skilled with their art.
I have one more question. I mean, to what extent, how you are maintaining the cohesiveness for your students' styles and the technique, especially when they're allowing to the different explorations or different material exploration and experimentations. So how do you maintaining throughout your process portfolio, and obviously it is going to be reflecting in your exhibitions. So how did you maintaining that challenges? I mean, you got my point?
What do you mean? How do the students maintain their own
how
style?
did you maintaining that styles and the techniques and the what do you say, the parameters, you know, how did you maintaining that consistency, basically the consistency of the experimentations?
Oh, I guess that's a really good question. I guess my students get really used to experimenting and idea developing. So every project they go through, well, in the first year, those 4 projects, it's built into those projects. In the second year, you'll find that actually most of that idea development is kind of done. Like in the second year when they come, they have their ideas. And some ideas flow into other ideas. So it really depends on the student. Some students want to do more experimentation and more idea and refining. Some students want to get right into their artwork. So I guess there is really no consistency in the second year of who's working on what at what time.
Okay.
Okay, so process portfolio, we'll just jump through this a little bit. First of all, what I do in my class is I always use the rubric for all of my assessments. So even in first year, whenever I hand back an assessment to a student, what I do is I give them, actually, I think I still print like paper. I don't give it to them digitally. When they submit their work, they give me, you know, their screens, and I ask them to self-evaluate themselves on the rubric, like tell me where you think you are, and then I circle where I think they are, and then that gives me more information for a conversation, so they know where they are. And what I also like to do with the students, because we also have to submit, usually I have to submit predicted grades like now, kind of October, November, at the beginning of second year. And so sometimes I go back to these rubrics and say, okay, if you submitted your work as is right now, this is what you would get at IB. But if you submit your work as I see you're working and I see where you're going and I see your planning, if you continue on that planning, this is where I think you will be. So I have that conversation with the students, because it's kind of like, it's confusing for them. Which is why I don't make checklists of like, you should have this, 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 and this in yours, because also not all process portfolios are made the same, and it's up to the examiner to find that the student has shown these parts. So different students can put in different things. So having said that, I'm going to show you how I do make them organize it, which explains it a little bit more. But I do stick very clearly to the rubric, because I like to make sure the students understand the clear wording, specifically of what's happening in the 7. Like we want to see an effective and consistent process. So we go over like, what is consistent? Are you showing me something that's consistent, or are you showing me something that you are developing? So we go through those kind of wordage. And we also use this design process a lot. I have this up in my room. I share it a lot with the students and make sure that the process portfolio is showing every single one of these stages. So the gathering ideas, the idea development, experimentation, composition, design. This is the part I find my students struggle in wanting to do. They don't like doing that. They like to gather their idea and go straight to the create. And this is the part that examiners find is lacking. It's this experimentation part in the process portfolios. Also, very important is the reflective part. After you're finished your creation, reflecting and possibly refining and redoing your artwork. So those words, reflecting and refining, come directly from the rubric. So I do make sure that my students do at least one refinement project where they've already created it, they refine their ideas, they reflect and evaluate, and then go back and fix it. So if you look at IB's rubrics, they want to see skills, techniques, processes, critical investigation, communication of ideas, reviewing, refining, reflective, and the subject specific language. But if you follow the design process, all of these are the parts that are in the design process. This is not totally the same, but you can see how they communicate and where they all show up. So it's kind of like a big mash of all of these things that IB is looking for. Doesn't occur in one activity. They occur throughout the process. So it's really hard if you organize your process portfolio within this criteria. So I usually organize my students' process portfolio with this criteria, because I know if the students include all of this, then they're going to hit what is required by IB in numerous ways. So it kind of gives them a little bit more information than trying to fit it into what IB is looking for. And just to keep in mind the art forms. So the process portfolio is specifically where the art forms come into play. The process portfolio, you need to have evidence that the students are working in all 3 of these forms. Not so much in the exhibition, but That's a matter of, it's discussed among examiners, and I've had some examiners that say they want to see artworks in all three forms. I've seen some examiners, and I've seen students that score 7 that have only focused on one form. But in process portfolio, all three of these need to be represented, and it doesn't have to be in the final artworks. It can be within the art making experimentation part. So what I usually do is I have this somewhere in my room as a guide to the students. If they're doing HL or SL, these are the parts of the design process that we focus on. And this is how many screens you should have from your 2 years kind of discussing these ideas. And these are some examples of how they can show up. Specifically, what I get my students to do, you do not have to show evidence of all 7 or 11 artworks. You don't have, you just choose. Usually what we do is we go through it, we choose 4 or 5 artworks possibly. But as they're doing screens throughout their first year, they come away with a lot of screens. And then we go through and decide where we need to add more of this, and we can create that in our second year. So it's a little bit strategic, I guess. We don't really do all of the screens for all the projects in year 2. We kind of just figure out what we need to add and how to elevate the screens that we did in year 1. So that's kind of how we do it. So let me just move that up. I did a workshop 2 years ago with, I'm a comparative study examiner, and I did a workshop with a process portfolio examiner and exhibition examiner. And so this is what the process portfolio examiner, the advice that they gave was, if you're looking to score high in your process portfolio, make sure that you have a really good balance of visuals and text. This is a really key point. I think is really interesting, that your images should be annotated and purposeful. I ask my students to label all their images, and I find that very useful because it gets out a lot of extraneous information. So it could be like photo of my sketchbook, experimentation with texture using paint. So that takes out like 4 sentence space. Like, you don't have to explain what you're doing. It's in the label. And then you can use the written part underneath to reflectively evaluate on how it's working for you. You don't have to, it doesn't have to be descriptive. So most of your writing in your process portfolio should be evaluating the process and reflective, what is working, what isn't working, not really describing what you're doing. The picture and the label should do most of the describing for you. So I thought that was a really key point. Art terminology is consistently used. That's a key. As what I said, it's too difficult to try and organize your process portfolio on that criteria for the IB rubric, because all the criteria kind of overlap, and that's totally fine. It's the examiner's job to find those parts through your process. You don't have to organize it for them. Also make sure that you're discussing your intentions throughout. Like, I wanted to do this, this is where this is leading. And personal voice, very key. Try to eliminate those sentences in your students' work that says, my teacher did this. I was working on a unit that my teacher said. It should all be self-initiative. So just a little tweak is, I decided to do this. That helps. Again, review and refine how the student's own opinion as an artist, reflective evaluative comments, and the impact of the materials and the artist is explicit and analytical. So you want to get away from the describing and then the experimentations. So that's what the examiner said is useful. One thing that I included here, because in the last workshop, people were wondering how to get the students in that mode for talking about their artwork and talking about their artwork in using the art vocabulary. So I'm a big fan of using strategies that have already been created. So I get my students to use Feldman's analysis. We use Feldman's analysis all the way since grade 6, all the way up. Whenever they do an artwork, whenever they do an art assignment, it always comes into me with a submission statement. So in grade 6, we learn the art vocabulary, elements of art, principles of design. So in grade 6, they are submitting their work, describing it, analyzing it, interpreting it, and evaluating it. So when they come to IB, they're so familiar with this, particularly the analysis part, that it's really easy for them to jump in and do the critical investigation of artists. That's the analysis part, to reflect on their own work. That's something that they've already done in the past. So I just put this in here as a little, like, this is very helpful. Not terribly happy. The students aren't terribly happy to do it at the beginning, but if you explain it to them, because they submit their artwork, you know that they have created, like, they have spent so much time on their artwork and they have all these great ideas, but you don't know what those ideas are by looking at their artwork. So you don't know how much time they spent. You don't know the other ideas that they were considering that they didn't include. So if they can explain their artwork to you, it will help you to assess it more holistically for them, and it will help you to understand their process more. So if they do get into the habit of doing the submission statement in the earlier years, it becomes very easy for them to get into that habit of talking about their work. We also do a lot of critiques in the class, but circle critiques, in that the students spend more time explaining their ideas, less time kind of evaluating other people's works. It's kind of more of a presentation of their ideas, and then students kind of tell them what they like about their artwork. Yeah, so those are my topics for process portfolio. So does anyone have any other strategies that they have found very useful for their process portfolio? And or encouraging students to do process portfolio screens, or to use their visual arts journal, or to talk about their artwork?
Hi, Emma.
Hi.
Emmy. Sorry, Emmy.
No, it's fine.
Sorry. Yeah, I like the part where you talked about the process portfolio. I know with my students that sometimes when they're working on their process portfolio, there's no continuity with their theme. And I've kind of like struggled with that, because if I look at some of the best examples from In Thinking IB, I see a lot of continuity with the theme, where the student starts off with a project and then you can see how it's growing into the final presentation of their artwork. But with my students, what I've noticed is that most of them, it's not kind of like laid out. They might just start a project by showing all the experiments, all the nitty-gritties that the IB is requiring, but later on, they choose to do something different again. So there's no continuity with certain pieces that they're working with towards the exhibition. So I've always found it challenging. And sometimes when my grades come back and I'm like, am I doing something wrong as a teacher? Or maybe it's just the strictness of IB marking all these students. Because I've had students that have followed a theme, and then later on work returns, or maybe the grades return, I still get that 5 when I predicted a 7 or maybe a 6. So I'm always kind of like confused with IB, like what is it that they're looking for? But after seeing from the examiner's point of view, what it is that you're looking for when you're marking all these students, I think I'm getting an understanding from that.
Okay, good. Also, I was going to suggest, so in IB, there's no required theme for the exhibition. For the process portfolio, it's not required. Comparative study, nothing requires a theme. Actually, in the examiner's report, they're usually quite empathetic about, or emphatic about, saying there is no theme. So that's why I find that having a few strong ideas, and your example where the student is doing like one idea and then jumps to a totally irrelevant idea or something totally new. What you might want to consider is including that, looking at the 2 works that don't relate, because there's something that relates about them. First of all, the student did both of them. but there's something else that might relate about both of them that you can make a connection and point that out to the examiner. So even though when the student created the artwork, maybe they didn't relate, you can kind of present it that they do relate in some way. So it might be like in the curatorial rationale, my students usually say, I was exploring ideas of, and then list 3 or 4 ideas. So it's not just one theme. So it doesn't like pigeonhole them into something, because my students do that all the time. Like their artworks are like, well, you were working on this and now you're doing this. What? Why? Why are you doing that? So if you can just kind of wordsmith it a little bit to make it make more sense when you submit it, that might also help you.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Yeah, of course. Any other questions, or I think I'm moving on to.
I would like to say something. Sorry. I have one question. I was told like maybe not to include a lot of, like try not to, like if I give them a work to do, like a specific project, some experimentation or something that the entire class is doing, that maybe I shouldn't like encourage students to use those pages, because it's like a given project and that they are very directed in some way. So I don't know how much of it you think it's correct or not.
You can include it, but you have to be smart on how you describe it. So I've done that, like you know your cohorts, right? Like it depends. Sometimes you have a class that shows up and just gets it. Sometimes you have a class that you have to like hand feed for the first few units. Okay, do this, do this, do this. And I've done that. I did one class I did like kind of similar to Pamela's idea, like choose an object and do this experiment to and this experiment. So the whole class had similar screens for the first 2 or 3 screens that showed their experimentation. But it was so valuable because it showed really interesting experimentation that they wouldn't have done on their own. So I thought it was really useful for them to include it. So we were just really careful about how we explained it. So the students explained it within their ideas. It was never, I'm doing an assignment, my teacher told me to do this. It was like, I decided, I was exploring line, I decided to look at this. You know what I mean? So you can talk, I mean, all your students work within that 2 years is valid to submit. I think it's just a matter of presenting it. And it also, your process portfolio does not need to be chronological. You don't have to include like the first thing you did on your first screen. You can take that experimentation and put it in the middle of, you know, another screen where it might not be so obvious that it was a teacher-led experience. It might flow into another project that they were working on that it kind of relates to. So you could maybe stick it in there. Does that make sense?
Yes, completely. But
okay.
Then how can I say this? Like if it's directed and they all do the same work, does it matter if maybe 2 or 3 students grab some of the same pages from this directed project and they send it to IB? Would it be a problem?
Okay, so if it's like a worksheet that you've handed out and they're just completing the worksheet and it's like you're answering questions or something and it's an obvious workshop sheet, I wouldn't suggest putting something like that because you want to, but if it's the students' work, like the students have the right to submit their work. So even if they're doing a similar work to the person beside them, if it's their work, they can include it. I mean, they can't take their colleagues' work and put it in their process portfolio. But if the only dicey thing about when it gets a little bit dicey, because a lot of people like to do group projects, and that gets a little bit concerning, like because it can only be submitted in one person's work, right? So who gets to submit this group work that everybody has worked on? So you have to cite it. Another thing that you could do if you're worried about something like that, if you feel like everybody has the same thing, when the students put it in, they can label it and cite it and be like, you know, a class activity or class instruction by teacher or teacher-led instruction. And instead of saying my teacher told me to do this, when they discuss it, they could say, my teacher led an experiment, or my teacher led an activity, and from that activity, this is what I took away. This is what I learned, and this is how it helped my process. So that's kind of what I mean. Like, you never want to, like, the student always has to own their learning and explain their learning in a reflective and evaluative way.
Okay, thank you so much. That's
Yeah.
very useful.
Okay, good. Yeah, it's kind of dicey. It's kind of like when you go through your students' process portfolio, like in second year, kind of just make sure it's always coming from their voice. So even if someone gave them feedback or something, as long as they take it in and explain how it helped their process, then it elevates their explanation, kind of thing. That's kind of more what the IB wants to see. Colette, you have your hand up. Did you have a question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, my question's a little premature, but the last question that Pam asked kind of prompted me or reminded me that I have a situation where I have a class of 9 students. Last year, one of those students made an art piece where they did a mold of their hand. And since then, 2 other students have wanted to do the same because the first one was so successful. The second student, I said, yes, you should do that. The third student, I tried to put her off, mainly because I didn't want to have 3 students out of a class of 9 to have a mold of a hand. So I wonder, and since then that student has subsequently created that mold of the hand. So now I have 3 students. They're functioning in 3 different ways, but I just wonder how that could be received, or if you've any kind of experience with anything similar to that in IB.
So my students copy my students' ID like this years before ideas all the time. It's like totally recycled in a school. It happens all the time because your students are only seeing like this vision, right? Like, I see this IB art exhibition and this is what I want to do. So I think it's totally fine if like they all have a mold of their hand, as long as it's connecting to their artwork and they're doing something about it that makes it different than the other person's. And the only people that are actually might ever notice that idea is like appropriated from someone else, another student, is the people at your school that go to your exhibition. Because an examiner is not probably like not even going to register, because an examiner marks so many works and they only see the digital copies. So they're not going to, like, to be honest, they see a lot of hands. So they're not going to register, like, and I don't even remember ever seeing a school name. Like, I really don't even pay attention to school names. So I don't think they're ever going to be like, oh, this school submitted 2 similar hand sculptures in 1 year. Because as a teacher, you check it, right? Like, you check it for authenticity. You like declare the student has done their own work. That's all IB is worried about. So yeah, okay. But I feel your pain. It happens all the time. I'm like, really? Do we have to do a projector series again?
Right.
Didn't they do that already? Like,
yeah. Okay, thank you for that. Thank you.
Yeah. But if you see through the lens of the students, like whatever you show them and whatever they see at your school, that's all they know, right? So that's where they're going to get their ideas from. VJ, did you have?
Thanks, Colette, for bringing that up. I think with Colette, we share the same problem. I had a student who was doing a collage and she was focusing on fashion, copying Jackson Pollock's techniques and just blending them in their own work. So I had 2 students who were doing similar works. And I was like, oh, maybe this would be problems with IB. But after Colette brought that up, I was like, okay, this is very good. I think I'm going to encourage her just to continue with whatever she's doing at the moment. Thanks very much, Colette.
Yeah, and the other, sorry. The other thing that you might like, if you feel like it's too similar, you could just mention to the students, like, did you guys know that this looks similar? Are you okay with that? Is there something you can do to make it different? Like, if you feel like it's too obviously similar. But I mean, they're small classes. It's like a big melting pot of ideas. So they do tend to, feed off each other. And as long as you as teachers know that it's their own authentic work, then you're safe. As long as you're not worried about plagiarism or something. Yeah. Okay.
Add on that, I would like to say one thing. The credentials is very important. I mean, Daniel and Colette, that the important things, appropriation art also can improve that. It is not like that. You can adopt the artist influence or Pollock influence or Andy Warhol influences. Even there are incidents, one of my students used Da Vinci's which used man in his digital artwork. And he clearly mentioned that, and I don't think so. I couldn't find out any issues came out. But when they are publishing in the any kind of resources for IB, they will remove that for the copyright issue. They will remove that particular image. That is a one thing. And the second thing is what I have felt. It is not a question. I mean, what I have felt about in PP. What you Abhi said, it is right. It is not required to be in the chronological order. It can be in anywhere. But the most important to we have to emphasize the students' creative expression, how they are presenting in the PP. I mean, it's supposed to be in a high order thinking way. And also it can be reflected in your probably the first unit what you have done, probably the identity or portraitures or patterns, how could be reflecting in there in the other unit probably. So you maybe can bring the chain, it would be more useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijay. All of this information is I literally just took from my my blog that I shared. So when you go to my blog, there's 3 main pages comparative. I think I did the official wording: art making, curatorial, and theoretical. So if you click on them, it goes step by step how to do each component, and all of these images are directly on there. So you can find all that information. So comparative study, again, I go straight from the rubric, just put the rubric in so we all kind of remember what the comparative study is asking for. Here we are. So sorry, I'm just reading the chats. Okay, so this is how I get my students to set up. It's very formulaic. I mean, there's room for movement, but I get them to do an introduction screen with the 3 artworks. Only choose 3 artworks. Don't make your life harder. You can choose 3 artworks from 3 different artists, or you can choose 2 artworks from one artist and 1 artwork from another artist. And if you're choosing 2 artworks from one artist, try and have them like in different stages of their career. Kind of like one of my students used Chuck Close, which is really interesting because you can use his early career and his late career is very different. And then they used another portrait artist, and I can't remember his name, but he's British. Anyways, and then what I get my students to do is, so their introduction screen and then their artwork analysis is 3 screens. If they're doing 3 artworks by 3 different artists, so they do 1 formal analysis screen, 1 function and purpose, and 1 cultural. And if they don't have enough on cultural, we look at conceptual and material. And that's the plan. It can weave, things can move, they can have more information on formal analysis, which will lead into function and purpose. Totally fine for it to be fluid, but if they start off with the plan, it gives them some foundation. If you're doing 2 artworks by 1 artist, you may not have 2 different cultural screens. Like that might be just 1 art, like 1 artist probably has 1 cultural screen, but it depends because, some artists might have 2 different stages of their life that you can talk about. And then we go into the comparisons. I make them spend 4 to 5 screens on the comparisons. I still go with the Venn diagram. I know in the examiner report, they're like, we don't need the Venn diagram, but I feel like they're talking to students that use a Venn diagram for all of the comparisons. What I do is I do the first screen is kind of a Venn diagram, and why I like my students to do that is because it organizes their thoughts, and then they go into detail from what they found in the Venn diagram, and then they use 4 screens to pick key parts that they can compare, picking out similarities and differences like composition or cultural influences or something, whatever they found that had the most information. And then for the HL, they do 4 to 5 screens of their reflective art making process. And that includes the whole design process. So you're not just including your final artworks, you're talking about how the artworks in the comparative study and how the artists in the comparative study have impact your whole art making process as well as your final work. So based on my exhibition, my examining observations, the most important thing to remember when you're doing a comparative study, it's about the artwork. It's actually not about the artist. A lot of people spend a lot of time talking about the artist, where they were born, like biographical information. The artist's life is important as it relates to the artwork, where the artist's cultural history, the artist's inspirations, what's going on in the city around them, what are they thinking, only as it relates to the artwork and if it inspired the artwork. So really key focus on the artwork as opposed to the artist. Again, I mentioned earlier, start it early in the class so it can inform the students' art making as they go along, which gives them more fodder for that reflective piece. I always like my students to choose like a theme or general idea, something that they can focus their artworks on. I mean, you can choose completely different artworks that have no relation, but I found when you get to the analysis part, the comparative part, if you've chosen like 3 portraits or 3 landscapes or 3 artworks that are exploring ideas of mortality or something, it gives you a little bit of an anchor for when you're comparing them. Again, make your screens visual, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute because there's a part in the rubric that is asking for your screens to be clearly read, but also creative. So that's, I can't do one and not the other. I always like my students to bold their artworks. I kind of strategize a little bit because I know examiners are human. And I know what the examiner process is, and that the examiners are marking. So they have a quota. They're trying to mark 100 or something units in like 2 weeks. And they're also teaching at the same time. So they're coming home after school and they're like, okay, I want to do 10 today. Okay, I want to do 20 this weekend. Probably spending a half an hour, like if they're organizing their time to go through one thing. So if the screens are hard to read, and they're like on a black background with white wording, the font is too small, or it's some fancy font that they have to focus on, it's not fun. And so then if you put the examiner in a not comfortable mood, obviously the examiner wants to mark fair. I'm not saying the examiner is not marking fair, but they're human. So I like to make it and I like to point out to the examiner what I want the examiner to see, like highlights. So if you want the examiner to know that you're using art words, like art vocabulary, like either you use them so consistently that the examiner's not going to see it, or show the examiner, here I am, I'm using art vocabulary. So I do like to get the students to think about it in that perspective, like show off what you want the examiner to see. Again, I think I mentioned this, I use theories that have already been used. I find McPhee's framework very useful in the early stages of the research to help them reflect on the audience view, on the artist cultural view. Feldman's analysis with the describe, interpret, analysis, like those key questions are really useful, and Venn diagrams, which is contested, I guess. It's not, some people don't like it, it's totally fine. The other thing that you want to consider is make sure you're going, especially for those analyzing slides and the cultural slides, because nowadays a lot of students are finding artists that are a little bit obscure. They might find an artist that they like on Instagram, and that artist doesn't have a lot of research. So I do encourage my students to choose artists based on the amount of information they can find about it. Because if you choose an artist that doesn't have a lot of information, that's going to be really tough. And when you get to the in-depth analysis, you're going to have to think outside the box. Like I have a lot of students that choose artists from Instagram, but there's no like Wikipedia pages on them. There's no ArtNet pages on them. There's no art gallery reviews on them. So it's really hard to figure out their inspiration. So we have to like find out, where is the artist from? What year did they paint the picture? What's going on in the city at that time? What is their descent? What is their cultural identity? How would that affect the painting of the artist? Did something specific happen in their life at that time? What are they interested in? that's a lot to try and find out if there's like, if it's not readily available. So just be careful with that. Okay, where am I? Okay, so I wanted to show these examples of one of my students' work just to illustrate the creative part, because this is my students, those 3 pages, the formal analysis, the function and purpose, and the cultural. This student chose for the formal analysis to pick out keywords and analyze them. So in the artwork, she found that she used Van Gogh, like such a regular, like very well known, very well informative artist. So there was a vast amount of information. And so, but we still had to think outside the box when we were presenting the analysis, and I'll explain to you in a minute, because first of all, we chose the key parts of the art vocabulary and highlighted it and explained it. And then for function and purpose, actually, I didn't want her to write like Van Gogh was born in this, Van Gogh was interested in painting wheat fields. Why? Why was Van Gogh interested in painting this wheat field? Like, what's going on with this wheat field? So I had her research the wheat field, and I had her research why Van Gogh was painting. And so she found out that actually Van Gogh was really interested in nature because he felt that there was a spiritual connection to nature. So he actually painted nature a lot because he felt that that was very spiritual. Like, he had connections early on with Christianity, and so there was a link there that he was exploring. So we zoned in on that for the function and purpose. And then for the cultural and conceptual analysis, we looked at that wheat field. So I had her Google and find pictures of that exact, like, what does that wheat field look like? And so she found photographs of what the wheat field looked like, what it looks like now, and what we can imagine it would have looked like in Van Gogh's time, and why Van Gogh was trying to paint it. And the other thing we did was, like, who were the artists working at that time that would have been inspired Van Gogh? Because his technique at that time, we all know, like, I mean, we all know the story, but I was trying to explain to her how to present it to the examiner that shows depth of research as opposed to just like Wikipedia biography. And then the other example I wanted to show you was the same student's work, because she scored like uber high, but her reflective process, because this is what I wanted to illustrate. For the reflective part, it's not just about the final artwork, it's about how the artist making that artwork that you analyzed influenced your process. So I already discussed how Van Gogh was inspired by this spiritual connection with nature. So my student took that idea and went out into nature and meditated and tried to like commune with the spirit of nature, and then did sketches. So she was kind of emulating Van Gogh's process. So that was number one. The next thing she did was, Van Gogh was heavily influenced by the color theory of Charles Blanc, which came out a few years prior to him. So she found that out. So she decided to experiment, first of all, with Van Gogh's color schemes, because he was also highly influenced by the Japanese prints that were coming over. So she chose 3 different color schemes of Van Gogh's artworks, and she painted that sketch in 3 different color schemes. She was kind of like trying to insert herself into Van Gogh's mind, I guess. And then the next thing she did was she researched that color theory that Van Gogh was interested in. This is like, what, 1813? So it's like pre-our color theory. So she researched that and figured out what information Van Gogh would be working with. And then she took it into her time and used the Adobe color theory. And she used the Adobe color theory to experiment with color combinations, which she used on her final work. So you can see how that Van Gogh painting, by going deep and exploring like the artist's inspiration and then using what the artist was thinking in the process, that gives you a deeper reflective piece. That was 3 screens. She did this. She had 2 other artworks that she focused on for the reflective screen. So you don't have to like include a lot. It's more, how has that artist kind of inhabited your whole process, more like informed your whole process. So I just wanted to highlight those. And does anyone else have anything to share on comparative studies?
I have a question. In relation to the reflective part, I've always had a hard time with some kids picking out their artwork really early, and then especially my HL kids of just trying to force like like they want to research a particular artist, but they didn't want to do the art part of it, or they're trying to be like, oh, I'm trying to figure out how this relates to one of my artwork, but it didn't really, because I always tell them like, use a critical investigation you've done in your artwork, and sometimes when we get to the comparative, and which I'm really surprised you do it so early, how do you I I know there's a part of like you can have that influence their future artwork. How do you like I know with the example she like I think made it a point to use Van Gogh in one of her artwork, I think after the fact. Is is there any like ideas of, is that why you do it so early, or like does it have to be of an artwork, or can it just be a part of like they make a process of making an artwork that's not necessarily for their journal, or that it doesn't necessarily, it's just a part of their art making as an artist? Sorry, it's a lot of questions, so yeah.
It's totally whatever works for you, to be honest. But yeah, that's why I do it early, because I want it. So I try to work smart with my students. They only have a limited time, so they have to make artworks that fit into this reflective part. They have to make artworks for their exhibition. It can be the same artwork, so that's how we do it. But it's also totally fine. Everything that you said can work. Like, students can create an artwork for their comparative study that's purely reflective based on an artist from their comparative study that is not in their exhibition. That totally works. They can also do part of a process of an artist and it doesn't lead to a final work, and that goes in the reflective scenes of their comparative study, and that's fine because it's showing a thought process. Like, so basically the reflective part is showing how the artist has inspired parts of the artist's process. So both of those are fine. But yeah, to answer your question, that's why we do it early, because I find that once they do the comparative study, it sticks in their mind, and the reflective screens are they're organically created. So it just gives a lot more research for that part.
And one last thing I just remembered.
Yeah.
For a lot of my kids, the Pinterest, the love of Pinterest of them all. I have a lot of my students who want to do that, and I make them, if ever they want to have that research, is go ask the artist, email them. And I have like a format just in case, like, don't ask them straight out, like, what's your cultural significance? Because I had a student who tried to do that, and I realized I didn't check her email to do that. And like, he had like, oh, there's nothing cultural about my artwork, which in the artwork as like objective, it was from Africa, and the style was very particular to where he was. And it was just a reminder of just like, some artists don't really think the way that IB does, of like, we don't think about like, yes, I put in my Filipino-ness into my artwork specifically. And so for you, is it okay if they find those creative ways to put in, there might not be like a direct source, but it's like alongside it, like they find their research to go outside that box of they were using this kind of style, and it's not particular from them, but like from like adjacent movement, or that can be related. So it's more like students' understanding of the artwork rather than like someone said it and critique said about this. I was worried about when she was doing her work.
No, that's exactly it. That's perfect. I spend a lot of time explaining that to students because they do the same thing. I'll talk to a student about an artwork and they'll say, this is a picture of a flower. And I'm like, okay, but they don't understand that, like, like that their culture, their walk to school, their talk with their friend, like whatever happened in their life is influencing the choices they made on making that flower, but they don't cognizantly know that. So the artist is the exact same thing. So if you ask an artist directly, which is super cool, and that looks super awesome in your resources, like your references, but the comparative study is meant to also it's meant to show the students' analysis of the work. So basically the students being an art critic. So if they notice that it looks like the artist has been inspired by another art movement, of course, include it. It looks like the artist was inspired by this, even if the artist is like, no, I wasn't. It's the student's analysis. And if the student can reference it. Like if it's properly cited and it's logical and it's like the student backs it up, then that's exactly it. Yeah. So that's really good. Call it. Did you have a question?
I do. Thank you for taking another one of my questions. I just wanted to know, if, my understanding is the comparative study is mainly student, like independent work. And at our school, the first time the students submitted their draft, like there was no way that, like, we're on our third draft and we will probably do more. And I wonder about how much, how much we should be kind of influencing and giving them feedback. I'm finding, I don't know if it's specific to our school or maybe my approach hasn't been strong enough in supporting them or letting them know that they need to kind of look at the criteria themselves so that they know, what's required of them. And I'm just wondering if you or others have found the same, that you actually do a lot of work on the comparative study with a lot of feedback.
I do a lot of feedback, and that's why I started early, and that's why we do it digitally, because it's continually edited and they send it to me. I get them to send it like on a Keynote, because I'm Mac, sorry, that's why we use Keynotes. Shout out to Keynote if you're using Mac, so good. But I edit it. I put like text boxes with questions throughout it. I'm like, what about that? Because students don't, this is the thing with IB rigor and IB expectations are so high compared to like an average level of a grade 12 student's understanding, right? So you're trying to push your student to this level, like this is the level of IB 7, right? And your students understand. So you're constantly like, what about this? What about this? So they don't understand the depth required to hit those high grades, and they can figure it out. Like it's doable, but they're not going to get it there by themselves. So you giving them feedback 3 or 4 times, yeah, I don't know how many times it, and that's another life lesson for the students. I find, like, if the students are really eager and keen and really determined to get those high grades, they're going to come from feedback often. They're going to show me what they're doing and they're going to value what I say, and then that's how those grades get achieved. If they don't want the feedback and they don't want to do 3 or 4 edits, then that's also their choice. That's fine. And a 5, a 4, literally over half of the IB submissions are 4s. So that's a very acceptable score. So yeah, I think we have a very similar experience.
Okay, thanks, Amy.
Yeah. Pamela and then Danielle.
Okay, I'm sorry, I asked a lot. I don't know if that's a problem. Well, I have been working on the comparative study since year 1, and I think it's useful because then they have way more time, and in case you need, you can go along through year 2. But I tend to give, because I don't know, I felt that maybe they needed like a structure for it. So like your slide thing, and I also gave something for concepts, so that they could talk about like how to use, again, the principles, elements of design, or how to talk about cultural, well, like the influences and everything for the artist. So I gave them like questions that they could use maybe as a guide, and then start answering them. But I don't know how much time do you spend in class, or if this is done at home, or how many lessons more or less do you get for this work? Because I think it's something kind of, it takes a couple weeks. And I also think, like, sometimes when, I think it was Colette who was saying about the feedback, because sometimes even if you ask the questions, I realize that some of the students are like really basic and they maybe are really trying, but I don't see that they're going to get to it. So sometimes I ask more than a question that would be like ideal, but give like, this is an example of what you can write. Or I give them like examples of comparative studies so that they can check how it should be written. So I don't know, like you were saying, like at some point, it's going to be the decision of the student if they take or not the comment or like the feedback. I don't know if you can help me with those things.
Yeah, completely. It really is up to the students. It sounds like you have some really good strategies in there. Another thing that I'm finding more and more with students is there's a lot of modifications within the class. And I find that sometimes there's a disconnect with students understanding the written expectation. Like what does that written like the written words, what should it sound like? Because when I talk and when I write, it's a very different thing. And I know that the students understand the concepts, but when they write it, they're very unclear how to do it. So sometimes I also do a few workshops with the students early on, and I get them, I get them to, like, we'll put a picture like on the projector, and I'll get them to explain, like analyze it and tell me what they're seeing in their words. And as they're talking in their words, I will write on the screen what they're saying in my language, in what the expectations of visual arts. So I'll elevate and use all that vocabulary. So instead of the students saying like, sorry, like, you know, the artist used blue for the water or something like this, I'll elevate it and be like, the artist chose ultramarine hue to emphasize the texture of the fluidity of the water. And I'll like, I know it's a little bit much, but the students don't understand the use of that language. It's very hard, especially if some of you are teaching in schools where a lot of the students are second and third language students. So they're really, that vocabulary is really a struggle, you know, like they're working in 2 or 3 different languages. So I do some extra work on that to help them to explain their ideas in that high level vocabulary that IB is looking for. So that's also an idea, but yeah, it is a lot of it can be a lot of feedback I spend in class. However, but that's why I created that blog. That's a step-by-step of how to do it, because that blog takes away like hours of class time that I don't have to go over it, because one student's struggling, but one student gets it. So I don't want to waste my class time explaining any of those concepts. So I just say like, I'll explain it quickly one time. And then I'll be like, refer, like, you know, go to the blog, and they can go to the blog at night whenever on their own time. And then they can approach me with feedback if they choose. So that's kind of how I got around it. We spend about, I think we spend 2 to 3 weeks in the first year doing the comparative study, which is mostly a lot of conversations, like what artist are you choosing, what direction are you going, and then the rest is on their own time. I mentioned before, it really is, it's the culmination of the work. You're working on it for 2 years, but the other components kind of like, you know, interweave with it, and it's so subjective. So it is really the most challenging one to predict. Again, go directly, and the exhibition is the one that I, for predicted grades by far, I'm pretty confident with my comparative study and my process portfolio predictions, but my exhibition, that's the other really fun thing about IB. The grade boundaries change every year, which we all experienced last year as a windfall, because in previous years, a 7 has been like 85 or 84 to 100. And last year it was 77 to 100. So you've got like, that's a 5 or 6 mark difference, where those students usually would be getting a 6 and they've got a 7. So the grade boundaries are they fluctuate. So that also creates issues with predicting. So to be honest, I don't think I've ever predicted a student for exhibition at a higher than a 25 or a 26. I'm also from the school though, where I am much happy to predict low and have the student be super happy on their grades, as opposed to predict high and have the student, you know, like actually get two marks down and they have to appeal, and no. So I'm actually pretty good with my predictions. I usually am between 1 and +1, like in my predictions, but that's, as I told you, how I do it with a spreadsheet and analyzing it every year. That's after 5 years of working with the same curriculum. So it does take some time to familiarize yourself with your own marking choices. So the other very interesting thing about the IB exhibition, and this could change, and probably the people that were prior to 216 noticed a change. The earlier curriculum prior to 216, we took photographs and we submitted the artwork. You had to photograph a picture of your exhibition, but the students could also record a video explaining their exhibition. And then the curriculum prior to that was even better because the examiner actually visited the show. Because I've had a lot of students in the past 2 years that create conceptual like installations and conceptual sculptures that in person are epic, like they're so cool, but they don't translate well to photography. And so you have some students that create artworks that when you look at them, they're very small, they're not terribly interesting, but they translate very well to photography. And so this is a digitally submitted course right now. So I do keep that in mind. And I also keep in mind, when you take photos of your students' final work, like get good lighting. I had a very specific spot in my school by a window, but the window was it wasn't direct sunlight. So it was perfect lighting conditions. We used to have a setup with like a lighting and a backdrop, but I found clear, like imagine lighting on a cloudy day. Like that's the perfect lighting to show off artwork. So watch your lighting, make sure your artwork is very clear, use your best camera. To be honest, my iPhone works better than the cameras at my school. So, and make sure they're very clear, include details. And the other thing, when you're taking photos of the student's artwork for the details, the 2 details sections, choose close-ups of the best part of their work and specifically zoom in on your camera. Don't take a picture and then load it into Photoshop and zoom in on that part. The examiners notice that and they're like, please don't do that. So it's really interesting if you can authentically photograph your students' work. Also, make sure that your exhibition text and your curatorial rationale are not the same. The exhibition text explains that's the time for the students to explain specifically that artwork, like what they're inspired, how they made it. And then the curatorial rationale is more about the overarching ideas about the exhibition and how the artworks connect with each other. And then if the students are in HL, you really want the students to discuss how the students intend the audience's experience to be in the exhibition. So where is the audience starting? What artwork are they looking at? What do you want the audience to know? What do you want the audience to feel? What's going next? What are they going to see? What are they going to think about? What is the general impression are they going to get of each of the artworks? Like, what are the messages? All of that. So it's really the curatorial rationale really focuses more on the exhibition, the cohesiveness, and the audience experience. So those are the 2 differences that I just wanted to highlight. And there's 2 more things I kind of want to highlight because this might help Colette a little bit with the scoring of the higher marks for that technical competence. So this is an example of my student. This is the same student, first year, second year. So during the first year, during our first project, I think this is portraits and patterns. Really, can you tell? Portraits and patterns, like it's very literal. Centrally, it's a central composition. The technique is good. Like this student is really has a really nice touch with her pencil. She's got a lot of technical competence. But she went to RISD for a workshop over Christmas and she came back with the second one. And you can see it's still portraits and patterns, but the technical skill and the interest of the composition has been really elevated. The student also has really developed a really good sense of value, the chiaroscuro, the highlights, and then the rumpled receipts in the background, really like that texture. This folding is really hard to do on a technical skill. So you're seeing this technical competence kind of put in this really creative conceptual way. And then that's what I mean about different ideas, like self-portrait and receipts. How does that even relate? But those are 2 of those ideas that the student is working on. So they're put in together. And this is kind of like a statement of how much money it took for her to live in New York for 6 weeks. Like she was always spending money on this and this. And one day she just looked around her room and it was full of receipts. But you can see this composition has so much more of a story going on than this composition. She had originally, like in first year, she was planning to finish this and submit it. And then in second year, she showed up with this, and she could see like the difference in the technical competence. So I like to show that and explore that idea of non-central composition, because that's a big one that students really always like to go first with, that centrally focused composition. The second thing I wanted to highlight was the conceptual qualities, because we all have these students. These are so this was the first idea of the student. It's highly conceptual. You know, the student's going through some emo issues. She's got eyeballs all around her. People are looking at her. It's very stressful. So conceptually, this is very strong. Technically, no, it's not. It's not great. The body's not proportioned. There's a lot of unfinished issues going on conceptually. The second one, technically, this is off the charts, right? Like this is super detailed, super unique. Like it's an eye, it's the student's eye. It's a really interesting off-center composition, but it's just an eye. So there's not a lot of conceptual movement. This would, you know, obviously this would look good in your house. This would look lovely in an art gallery. Like this would probably sell. It's a beautiful composition, but in terms of IB, what they're looking for conceptually, it's a scientific illustration, essentially. So for conceptual, what you want to do is you want to explore that idea of different ideas coming in. So then this is the student's final work where we went through these discussions. So we still get that technical skill in the eye, but now we've also got a lot of conceptual ideas going on. We've got some different stories coming in. We've got a different mirror. We've got some cultural relations that we can talk about. So there's a lot more going on in this picture. It's not as predictable as this picture. It's not as like one-stop idea as this picture. So this is kind of giving the IB examiner more to kind of explore or to examine the technical and the conceptual thought behind a work like this. So I just wanted to show you those two examples because I think they give you a clear understanding of kind of what I have found that IB kind of gravitates towards in terms of the assessments. So from the exhibition examiner, what they said was, first of all, make sure the exhibition is a coherent body of work, which means consider that your artwork will be on display in a gallery and the people's first impression of your artwork will be as a collective. So if your artworks look more like a collection, you will gain more marks. So try to make sure your pieces look like they belong. And that could just literally be the student's style, right? Like the student has the same style throughout the works, but he suggested that this examiner suggested that a theme is an easy way for your work to connect. So technical competence, you have to show your examiner that you're able to use your chosen media skillfully. And this examiner said he liked to see the 3 different art forms. So what I do with my students is we do hit all 3 art forms, and then for the rest of the works, they choose the medium that they excel at. So if you like painting and you're painting is your skill, then we're going to do 5 paintings, and we're going to do some sort of photographic collage mixed media, and then we're going to do some sort of sculpture kind of thing, because the medium that your student is most skilled at is the one you want them to focus on for the exhibition to show that skill. But obviously you can mixed media is always the best kind of experiment if they're a painter or an illustrator, because then you can get that experimentation part in as well. Like as I explained in the conceptual, kind of consider different ideas, motifs, and then what I explained for the curatorial, like how do you arrange your exhibition in the space, and how do your works respond, and what is the relationship between the artworks and the audience? Those are the key parts of the exhibition that I have kind of found are useful. Vandita, you have something to share or a question?
No, just to share, for comparative study, I found a way where we can balance students' learning of the command words, realizing how to investigate, where does the referencing come in, and what is comparative study. What I do is I have a collaborative project where the students come together and create a comparative study mural. So they actually have a wall space that's given to them where they sit together and they choose together the 3 different artworks that they're going to critically analyze using the 3 contextual investigation, the analysis forms. And that has been very, very helpful. And like, I agree with what you just said, that rather than helping, it's better to give them everything at one time. And then if you need to, you can go back and revisit 1 or 2 people and to 1 or 2 students. And at the same time, if you have everything, I put everything on Google Classroom, so all the students have access to the information. But during that course of learning what is comparative study, while they're doing it together, it's very easy to sit with one student and explain to them who may have more difficulty in understanding than the others. And it's amazing to watch that you can sit back and actually see how the students communicate between each other and teach each other what exactly is required. We also have our librarian come in, who is part of at least 1 or 2 different classes. And so they go through the whole referencing at the same time. So that's been very, very helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I totally second that. The magic with IB is when the students help each other and you just get to watch like them communicate and help each other elevate their process. It's so fun. And I love your idea of putting up the comparative study as well, because then you have other students that are also able to discuss and kind of give feedback to each other student. So that's really great. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah. Thanks.
Vera?
Hi, I actually have both questions for comparative study and exhibition, but I'm just gonna ask exhibition first, and then if any other have the exhibition question, and then after they finish their exhibition question, then I ask the comparative study question later on? Yeah, so my question for exhibition is I have one student, he is doing emotion, all of the works he's doing like related to emotion, but he found that it's kind of hard to find a connection between each of them, because each emotion have different things. So how can he connect all the emotion like sadness, happiness, fear, anger, this kind of thing, like make it connected together? Yeah, so just have this kind of question. Yeah.
Well, that's really interesting, because first of all, the connection is they're his emotions, right? And then secondly, I mean, if he does an artwork that looks at all the emotions, that gives you information for other artworks. So it might be interesting to see where that student is going to go next. And if they're going to focus on one of the emotions, or if emotions is going to appear in a few other artworks. And then you'll start to see that connection evolve. Like maybe he's exploring all the emotions in one artwork, and then he focuses on anger in another artwork. So then, you know what I mean? Having a lot of emotions in one artwork is not a bad thing. It opens the door to like so many possibilities of where that student can take it.
So if his like emotion, like each emotion have its own story, is that connected? Like
it could be, yeah. And like it depends where the student wants to go, because emotions could be like a very general theme that he explores through many artworks, and he explores all the different emotions. So you have one artwork that's about all the emotions, and then specific artworks focusing on different, like one, like, you know what I mean, different but one sadness, one. Yeah, there's many different ways to go. So I think it gives him a lot of opportunities.
Hi, sorry, can I pitch in? Last
Yeah,
year, one of my students was exploring the same idea, emotions, and she had got 6. If you want, I can share, not right now, I mean, it's difficult to share here right now, but I can like share it with you.
Archana, you can also share it on the Facebook group. VJ, you've been waiting for a while, sorry.
Yeah. No issue. Just a quick doubt. It is not a question. In the CES criteria F, okay, the criteria F, the getting the influence from the artist. It is eligible. The students can they can do the same copies to they can include in the process portfolio. It is going to be double dipping. It's going to be problematic. Is it clear?
Okay, yes. So double dipping. That's like it.
Because you didn't mention about in your in the introductory slides about the CS, especially criteria F.
So because okay, so the way IB is set up now, in earlier incantations, the examiner visited the school and saw all the artwork together. Now you have 3 different components examined by totally different examiners that never see one component. So the only gatekeeper for double dipping is the teacher. So the teacher has to be cognizant of what the student is doing and authenticate and acknowledge that the student isn't double dipping. And what I do for, so in my mind, double dipping is using the exact, like copying a screen and putting it into another, like copying a comparative study screen and putting it into a project portfolio, a process portfolio. That's double dipping in my mind. But using the same artist to inform both processes, in my mind, is not double dipping, because they're looking at it in 2 different ways. In the comparative study, they're looking at the artist's influence to their own artwork, specifically just that one artist, and they're analyzing that artwork. But in the process portfolio, no artwork is only inspired by one artist. There's many artists and there's many inspirations coming on, and there's many different processes. So it's not direct, like, so the comments for each of those screens are very different. There's a different focus. So the students have to, like, so they can use the same artist in both, but they write 2 different screens because the focus is very different for those 2 components. Does that make, so
Yeah.
that's how I approach it.
Correct. Thank you so much. Thanks for
Yes. Pamela, you're next.
Thank you. It's more like about the process than the exhibit itself, but I wonder if you use like a rubric that you give to the students about the technique, if it's like the IB or something specific on the expectations. And I didn't understand very well, like you said something about the plan for year 2, in which you said something about like talking one-on-one with the students so that they could have a plan. So they basically tell you like, okay, I'm going to do 6 art pieces and this is going to be my plan, and they give you a topic or like how deep it goes if from the beginning, like for their big plan. Okay, so I don't know if you can talk a little bit about it. Thank you.
Of course. Shoot, I forgot what your first question was.
The rubric.
The rubric, thank you, the rubric. So no, I don't create any other rubrics. I go directly from the rubric, because what I have found, there's so many ways the student can approach it. But what I do is I show a lot of exemplars. I show a lot of examples to students of past, not only students from my school. I'm pretty, what's a good word? I research a lot, and I find examples from other schools, and I show, and I also visit a lot of art, like DP art shows. Whenever a DP art show is going on, I go to the exhibition, I take photos, and I share with my students. So I'm always like showing the students how other people are approaching it, because there's no one right way to do it. And it becomes too formulaic if you say like, you must have this and this and this, because that's what the rubric is asking for, is like those keywords, like something consistent, or showing like, I don't remember the keywords right now, but that can be demonstrated in many different ways. So to your answer, I just stay on the pure rubrics. I don't usually recreate new rubrics, or give a checklist of what I'm expecting. When the students send me their work, I go through it with the rubric and say like, okay, this looks like you're developing, this looks like this is a high level, this looks like, and we look at it that way. Because there's too many options of ways that the students can approach it. I kind of don't want to limit them to my own vision of what it should be, because sometimes they surprise me and come up with different ways of approaching it, and I like to be open to that. Your second question was about the exhibition, right?
More like the plan for year 2.
The planning. So yes, so my one-on-one, So my one-on-one meetings like are basically interviews with the students, and they do, because my students are used to the students before, like they saw the students process before, because that board is up every year. They watch what the students do. They go to the DP exhibitions. They, in grade 11, they have to like host the exhibition for the grade 12s. They're used to that process. And because I show so many exemplars, they know what is required to score those high grades. I show exemplars of all levels. Like we look at what is a 4, what is a 5, what is a 6, what is a 7? How is this a 6 and that a 7? Like what is going on here? What could the 6 have done to make it a 7? Like we have all those conversations. So the students know the expectations. So when they come to the one-on-one interviews, they already have a visualization of what their exhibition what they want their exhibition to look like. Even in the beginning of year 2, they've already forward thought their plan. To be honest, most of my students show up in grade 11 with like, I want to do this, I know what I want to do, because we've ingrained that process so much. So the one-on-one, yes, they know what they want to do. They know their key ideas. Like maybe they have a specific theme, or maybe they have 3 or 4 ideas they're exploring. They have 3 or 4 or 5 artists that are really influencing their process. And then I have them, depending upon their goals, like if they want to score a 7, then they have to show up with at least 8 artwork ideas. If they are more interested in you know, like a 4 or 5, then if they have 6 or 7 artworks, that's good to focus on. It really depends where they want to go, but yeah, they do show up with a very clear plan. I assign that. So we talk about it at the end of year 1 before summer, and I say, go and enjoy your summer. If you're in with the art challenge, join this chat group. If you're not in with the art challenge, that's cool. And during the summer, their expectation is to work on different things that they've already chosen that they want to work on, and they must come back to school with their plan. And it doesn't have to be like a bunch of sketches. It could just be a list. I mean, some of them write it 5 minutes before their meeting. Some of them take their time and plan it, but it just gives us a direction.
Thank you so much. And something very, very small. Well, teachers are going to be like behind the students. So, like you can see the process and where they grab ideas, but what about plagiarism? Because you can pass it in the IB when you upload it, but for the written part, but not for images. So what do you use for the images to see that there's no plagiarism at all?
So that's on you as the teacher. You're the one authenticating it, right, when you submit it. So the best way I know to combat plagiarism is to watch the students. Like I know my students' skills, I know my students' talents. I watch my students make those artworks. So if they're making an artwork at home that I haven't seen any process, any idea development, then I question that. So when my students are working on art projects like during the holidays that I can't watch, I ask them to send me photos. Send me photos of that process. And then I'll ask them questions. What are you going to do about this? Like, what is your strategy for this? How are you going to use this material? What are you thinking of next? So it's kind of like a system of balance, checks and balances, I guess, within me and that student. So that's why within those one-on-one conversations, I'm also questioning about all those ideas, because you're right, plagiarism is a big deal. So you, as a teacher, you have to be very cognizant of where those ideas come from. And I mean, you can use other artists' work. You can use other artists' work within the student's artwork as long as it's cited. So if you notice one of your students has appropriated an artwork that they've edited or changed, as long as in the exhibition text you cite where that artwork came from and, you know, give credence to it, that's fine. It's just a matter of when it's not cited and when that student tries to say it's theirs when they've taken the idea from someone else. So that's how I approach it.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Daniel?
Yeah, so most of the questions have been answered, and I had a bit of strategies for the comparative study. What I normally do for my comparative studies is that first of all, I just get it out of the way in the first year of IB. And I kind of like use the assessment rubric to generate questions for students. So I set up the rubric as a assignment for students. So let's say for the first one, where students are supposed to be researching about the artists, that would be like a unit for them. And then later on, when they're all done with all the assessment, assessment rubric, I pick on it again later on in the year, like maybe in the second year, just to polish it up, finalize it, give them feedback by using notepads. And then after that, they're on their own. They can choose whatever artist that they feel like maybe they want to change the comparative study, or maybe they want to carry on with the first one that they had picked from first year. So I just go with that, if maybe that is going to help with other people here.
Thank you, Daniel.
Yeah.
Brian?
Right, so my question isn't really about strategies or anything. I just want your opinion and even the group's opinion on this. So last year we saw a huge jump in the level of, or the results, should we say, across the IB globally, not just in visual arts, but in every subject. And that was due to algorithms and predictive grading, and I understand that. What impact do you think that's going to have this year on our cohort? Are they going to try and move back towards more harsher, stricter ways of grading to reestablish the integrity of the IB, or are they going to continue on and acknowledge the fact that our students too have lived and have tried to work through a pandemic?
Brian, that is the $1 million, it can't be $1 million question anymore. It's more like $1 billion question, right? With our inflation of money. No one knows. And that's what we kind of all have to wait and find out. And it's so interesting because that conversation on the Facebook group for years has been, why is the visual arts in particular? It's the most popular group 6 group by miles, and it's the hardest. Like, it's so hard. It's the smallest percentage of 7s. It's very challenging to score high. So last year was, yes, due to COVID, but it was like a breather, right? Like, even though the standards went down, so 77 and to 100 got a 7, it brought our average up, but it still didn't bring our average up so that it's like visual arts is a high scoring course. It's still like one of the lowest scoring courses. So we just have to wait and see, because the students now, it's really interesting that you asked that, because we were just discussing this the other day. The students that are taking the IB, like in grade 12 now, haven't had a regular year of classes since like grade 9 or something, like they haven't had the benefit of scaffolding their lessons. They haven't had the benefit of the year 1 IB in the classroom. So yeah, they're definitely also struggling. So it's really unsure if they will get that. Like, oh my God, how demoralizing for the students if IB raises the grade average. And yeah, it's a cluster. I don't know. I don't have an answer for you. I hear you, I understand you, but does anyone else have a prediction that they want to make on that?
I mean,
Daniel, you have your hand up.
I won't hold anyone to it. I'm just looking for people, just to see the groups.
Right,
ideas
just to understand the predicted grades and to like prepare your students. It's tough.
I mean, with us in the Philippines, we're the only country in the world that doesn't have face-to-face, and my students haven't seen each other in person since the beginning of the pandemic. And so in the Philippines, it's like the collective of the IB coordinators that have been talking about like how strict it is. Even like in math, their IAs are still up in the air, especially with VA. Every single art teacher I've talked to, IB art teacher in the Philippines, have no idea what the IB is going to do or what they've decided, especially in our situation. So I think depending on the country, I think, or at least with what I've talked about with my IB coordinator about like trying to ask for like leniency or something, at least for our country. But yeah, getting a 7 in VA, like I got a 4 when I did it in high school, and I was just like, how do I make a 7 for these guys? So yeah, it's still something that I know.
Thank you, Kath. Yeah, the Philippines are still, you guys are still like out of school, right? Still in lockdown.
Yeah, it sucks. Like I've been how to teach techniques. I see them like this only, and so it's been a struggle. And I have this is now my second cohort in the pandemic, still like this. And some of my students are like in a different country, or not even in. They're in like the boondocks kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Just because of that. And so, what to do about like they all have to have technical skill, which I can't watch them because no one wants to turn on their camera because kids. And so when we like things like this is so helpful for me just because I'm the most like seeking out workshops, even though it's like 5 a.m. right now. The sun is rising, guys. And so yeah, it's so super helpful. And like I have like talked to other examiners, especially here in the Philippines, of just that whole thing with like I had an examiner like chew me out saying like you don't need to have three of them in your three of the forms in your thing, or you don't follow a theme, or your technical competence is not there. I was just like, oh, okay, I'm a terrible teacher. Okay, I'll work harder. And so things like that is just to level off of like my 4 years of just like I need to work harder for my kids. Just meeting those standards.
It is really isolating, and like in your case particularly being digital and online for so long, it's just I've noticed through these 2 workshops and not having any workshops to go to, I've noticed art teachers in general, like it's kind of like we're the teachers in the school that I don't know, we're like, you know, kind of like in our own art room doing our own thing. We're not in the forefront of people's concern, and I've noticed that a lot of art teachers right now are feeling very isolated and questioning like these things, like the grade average can jump 6 marks. Like how do we even prepare for that? Like hi, this is all of your experiences and questions is super enlightening, and it is really a challenging time right now. It's no answers, but just getting together like this and just seeing faces and like hearing other people's practices kind of is a little bit like, I don't know, it just kind of it allows us time to connect and a little affirming, I guess, like a little soul affirming, like yes, we are doing the right thing, we're doing it, we're getting it. Archana, I'm sorry, I noticed your hand up. It's been up for a while. Did you want to have our final question of the workshop?
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to ask that do you have or anyone else has any strategies when the students are extremely raw? Like for my students, they don't have the opportunity to take art in their middle school. So in terms of skills and knowledge, both they are very, very raw. So anyone has any strategies how to pull them quickly?
I had a student 2 years ago. She came, oh, where'd she come from? Denmark, I think. She's gonna kill me if I don't get her country right. But she had never taken art before. She wanted to take philosophy. Our school didn't offer philosophy, so they suggested, well, why don't you take IB art? So it's done, and she scored a 7, so it's possible. She was a super hard worker, so again, the onus is on the student as like how engaged are they or how motivated they are to learn. There is literally no shortage of social media sites, YouTube videos, Instagram posts from artists, TikTok, that show specific skills. So it's not difficult in this day and age for a student to learn drawing skills, painting skills, all of that stuff. It depends on their motivation. Pamela had a good suggestion for the beginning students in the first year to really focus on that key vocabulary, the art vocabulary and experimentation, and kind of getting in there and doing more teacher-led units during those first few units and stepping through the process so the students clearly understand, you know, that design process, the different segments that need to go in their process portfolio, and then giving the students feedback. And then you could also suggest to the student to, it depends how the student works. Like, is the student an independent worker and they can work on watching social media videos, or does the student need a tutor? Like maybe the student could reach out and find somebody that can, you know, act as a second a second set of guidance to them. That could also be an option. So I don't know, those are my suggestions. Anyone else?
I would say maybe at the beginning, make them feel safe so that they can do things that you can be like accurate about, more or less like a process, so that you get a good result at the end, so that they don't feel from the beginning like, oh, I'm struggling, I don't know how to do anything and this looks very bad. But if you do something that can be kind of simple and that you can use to analyze or something else, maybe that will give them some security about, well, maybe I can give it a try. And from that, you can start like a relationship with the student so that they start finding their own voice or like experimenting, and from there you can start developing it more. I had a couple students really struggling, no art whatsoever, and I feel that about confidence really helped. And from there they just started, as Amy said, like getting really hard workers. Like actually one of them is one of my best students, and she's not even very skilled, but just because she worked very hard, now she's getting better and it's getting like one of the best of the class.
Thank you, Pamela. Okay, so I had one more slide to share for everybody before we go. Just to reiterate, you are all awesome. You're awesome, and you're awesome. In case you haven't heard it enough, you guys, thank you so much for joining me. I hope this was helpful. I love how we're able to get together. It's so cool that everybody is from so many different places and we can all virtually communicate and share our concerns. Yeah, I hope this was helpful for you, and best of luck.
Thank you, Amy.
Oh, you're more than welcome. My pleasure. Have a good night. Have a good day. All that good stuff wherever you are.
Thank you so much, Amy.
Thank you so much. This was a great support.
Thank you, Amy.
Bye.
Thank you.